2,500 years before Israel existed as a modern nation, before the state was declared, before the flags were raised, before the world even had a word for Zionism, a community in the mountains of East Africa was already living as Jews. Not converting. Not discovering. Already practicing. Already praying. Already copying sacred scrolls by hand onto goatskin and sealing them in clay jars to survive the centuries. No rabbis. No Talmud. No connection to the outside Jewish world. Just ancient oral traditions guarded by aging priests who carry knowledge that exists nowhere else on earth. Knowledge that was never written down. Knowledge that will vanish the moment they close their eyes for the last time. This is Beta Israel. And the world has almost no idea they exist. This isn't a remote legend or a disputed footnote in an academic paper. This is a living, breathing community with a documented history stretching back before the Second Temple. Before the diaspora. Before everything most people think of when they think of Judaism. While Rome was still a republic, while Europe's great empires were still centuries away, these people were already observing the Sabbath, in the highlands of Ethiopia. And yet, for most of recorded history, they were invisible to the rest of the Jewish world. Completely cut off. Not by geography, by war, by the kind of isolation that only mountains and centuries can create. The Simeon Mountains of northern Ethiopia didn't just protect them. They swallowed them whole. Imagine practicing a religion, keeping every law, memorizing every prayer, copying every sacred text, for over 2 millennia, with zero contact from the outside world. No reinforcement, no updates, no scholars debating interpretation. Just you, your priests, your goatskin scrolls, and the faith your ancestors passed down like a flame cupped in both hands, terrified of the wind. That's Beta Israel. And here's the part that will genuinely stop you cold. Mainstream Judaism didn't even believe they were real Jews until the 1970s. A community that had been practicing the faith longer than most Jewish institutions have existed was told, plainly, that they didn't count. That their 2,500 years of devotion didn't qualify. We'll get into why, and what changed. But first, you need to understand what was actually found inside those mountain villages. Because what the priests were hiding in those clay jars, shouldn't exist. What they found inside these walls shouldn't exist. And it changes everything you thought you knew about Jewish history. When researchers first gained access to Beta Israel's mountain sanctuaries, they weren't prepared for what was inside. Hand-copied Torah scrolls. Written on goatskin. Stored in clay jars. Not printed, not digitized, not archived, just raw animal skin and ancient ink, surviving on instinct and faith alone. Some of these scrolls were being actively copied by hand while Europe was still deep in the Dark Ages. While medieval kingdoms were crumbling and the printing press hadn't been dreamed of yet, priests in the Ethiopian highlands were sitting by candlelight, dipping reed pens, and continuing a tradition of preservation that had already been running for 1,000 years before them. Scholars who study the Dead Sea Scrolls talk about the miracle of preservation in desert caves, controlled temperature, extreme dryness, sealed stone. Beta Israel scrolls survived humidity, altitude, war, famine, and the slow collapse of the civilization around them. Not because of ideal conditions. Because people refused to let them die. But here's what makes this even more extraordinary, and this is where the history gets genuinely uncomfortable for mainstream Judaism. Beta Israel's version of the faith didn't just predate modern Jewish practice. It predated the entire rabbinic tradition. No Talmud. No Hanukkah. No synagogue structure as the wider Jewish world knows it. They follow only the Torah and their own sacred oral law. They observe a text called the Orit, ancient, distinct, unknown to virtually every Jewish scholar outside Ethiopia. A scripture that the rest of the Jewish world doesn't recognize. I don't study. Barely knows exists. And then there's the ritual that stops every historian cold. Beta Israel still practices animal sacrifice. A rite mainstream Judaism abandoned 2,000 years ago, after the destruction of the Second Temple, this community never stopped. Because for them, there was no destruction. No rupture. No theological earthquake that forced a reinvention of practice. They just kept going. Unchanged. Unaware that the rest of the Jewish world had moved on without them. This isn't a branch of Judaism. This isn't a regional variation or a cultural adaptation. This is something closer to the original than anything else that survived, sealed in a mountain village while the rest of the world rewrote the religion around it. Now, the scrolls are only half the secret. What the priests have memorized is something the scrolls don't contain. Something that was deliberately never written down. And that decision, made centuries ago, is now the most dangerous thing about Beta Israel's survival. If you're watching this story, hit the like button so YouTube understands you want the next chapter unlocked. And tell me in the comments, which beautiful country are you watching from? And what's the exact time there right now? There's a word in Beta Israel's world that doesn't translate cleanly into English. Kesim. It means priest, but that definition doesn't come close to carrying the weight of what these men actually are. They are not just religious leaders. They are the living archive. Every oral tradition, every ritual sequence, every prayer that was never committed to goatskin, it lives inside them. When Kes dies, a library burns. And right now, the libraries are burning. Only a handful of fully trained Kesim remain. Not dozens. Not a quiet retirement community of elders passing wisdom to eager students. A handful. Men in their 70s and 80s carrying an unbroken chain of oral tradition stretching back further than most world religions have existed. And the young men who should be sitting at their feet, memorizing what cannot be written, most of them are gone. Emigrated to Israel. Pulled by the promise of modernity, education, opportunity. Pulled by everything that makes a young person leave the village their grandfather's grandfather was born in. You can't blame them. But you also can't pretend the math works out. Here's what the scrolls don't contain. The Kesim carry the precise ritual sequences for ceremonies that exist nowhere in writing. The specific intonations of prayers so old their linguistic roots predate modern Amharic. The exact procedures for sacrifice, for mourning, for the agricultural festivals Beta Israel observes on a calendar that diverged from mainstream Judaism before the Common Era. None of it written. All of it memorized. All of it one generation from gone. There was a deliberate reason it was never written down. In a community that survived centuries of persecution, putting sacred knowledge on physical objects meant that knowledge could be confiscated. Could be destroyed. Could be used as evidence. The oral tradition was the community's encryption. You can't seize what lives only in a human mind. The tragedy is that the same logic that protected the tradition for 2,000 years is now what makes it impossible to save. You cannot digitize Kesa's memory without his cooperation. You cannot archive what he hasn't chosen to share. And some of what the last Kesim carry, they have never told anyone outside this community. Not researchers. Not the Israeli rabbinate. Not their own children who left for Tel Aviv. The clock isn't running. It's already nearly stopped. And then, in 1984, Israel decided it couldn't wait any longer. In November of 1984, a passenger jet lifted off from a refugee camp in Sudan in the middle of the night. No announcement. No press release. No official record that anything was happening at all. On board, Ethiopian Jews. Beta Israel. The community the world had spent 2,000 years forgetting. And they were finally going home. What followed became known as Operation Moses, one of the most audacious covert extractions in modern history. Coordinated secretly between Israeli intelligence and the Sudanese government, the operation moved over 8,000 Beta Israel men, women, and children out of famine-ravaged Ethiopia through Sudan and onto Israeli-bound aircraft over the course of 6 weeks. 6 weeks. A community that had waited 25 centuries was being airlifted to the Jewish homeland in less time than it takes most people to change jobs. People who had never seen a rabbi, never heard of Hanukkah, never read a word of the Talmud, landing in Tel Aviv. The ancient and the modern, colliding on a runway at 3 in the morning. And then someone talked. In January 1985, an American Jewish organization issued a press release. They were proud of what Israel had done. They wanted the world to know. Within hours the story was everywhere, and within hours the Sudanese government, furious at the exposure, shut it down completely. Planes that were supposed to return for the next group of families never came back. Thousands of Beta Israel who had already made it to the Sudanese border, who had already left their villages, who had already said goodbye to everything they had ever known, were left behind. Stranded in refugee camps. Some of them for years. The operation that was supposed to bring Beta Israel home cut the community in half instead. Operation Joshua came weeks later. Operation Solomon in 1991, a massive airlift that brought over 14,000 people to Israel in 36 hours. By the early 1990s most of Beta Israel had reached the homeland they had kept faith with for 2 millennia without ever seeing it. But the Kesim who made it to Israel found themselves in a country with a fully developed rabbinical structure, one that didn't recognize their authority, debated their legitimacy all over again. The community that survived isolation, survived famine, survived persecution, walked into their promised homeland and was handed another identity crisis. They kept the flame alive for 25 centuries. Cupped in both hands, terrified of the wind. And the wind found them anyway. The Beta Israel survived everything the world threw at them. But they couldn't survive being found. The community that kept Judaism alive longer than almost anyone on earth is now disappearing, not because of enemies, not because of persecution, not because of mountains or centuries or clay jars running out. Because of success. Because of my arrival. And that might be the saddest part of this entire story. If this kind of hidden history is what keeps you up at night, hit subscribe and press the bell button, you're going to want to watch this next. In New York City, behind unmarked doors and curtained windows, an entire parallel world operates by its own laws, its own economy, its own language, in the middle of one of the most surveilled cities on the planet. Most New Yorkers have walked past it 1,000 times and have no idea it exists. That story is right here. They've been hiding in plain sight, inside New York's secret Hasidic Jewish world. It's already waiting.